Hey everybody, just wanted to do a real quick intro on this one. I recently had an opportunity to be a guest presenter again on Linda Nickell's weekly Happiness Hour series that she puts out. On my previous one that I hosted back in May, I dove into more my Lightroom Classic kind of top 5 favorite tricks. On this one, I wanted to talk more about my overall creative process from visualization in the field to how I bring that vision to life back when I sit down at the computer. So I hope you like this. It's about an hour long, so definitely sit back and relax while you watch. Also, please do check out the rest of the videos that Linda's got up on her channel. She's had some great hosts, including last week, one of my good friends, John Fischer, had a great presentation on how he uses Photoshop for his post-processing. He took some viewer images and ran through some quick edits on those. And also, if you haven't been following along, I've been doing a new tutorial series over on Instagram Reels, Lightroom in a Snap. They're quick 15 to 30 second little light bites of tips and tricks that I use within Lightroom. Please check those out. I think you'll find them useful. In the meantime, hope you're doing well and take care until next time.
Hello everyone, I'm Linda Nickell and welcome to another session of my Happiness Hour. My goal here is to help us all connect, inspire, and create. We do this every Wednesday night, live here on Zoom with a new topic and a new speaker. On Tuesdays, I post a list of upcoming presentations to my Instagram at Cousin Linda, and on my website at lindanickell.com. And that's where you're going to find the links to our previous sessions to YouTube. Erin Randall is here tonight, so say hello, Erin.
Still Erin. Hello.
Our guest this evening is Michael Runn, who is joining us from Fort Worth. Michael is a landscape photographer whose love for nature, combined with a mindful creative goal of composing his images, has filled his website with moments that capture not only the scene before him, but an emotional connection to the place he is photographing. In tonight's session, The Anatomy of an Image, from Visualization to Realization, Michael shares his thoughts on the creative process from visualizing them in the field and then breaking down his digital darkroom process as he creates his final image. So Michael, your YouTube channel is coming along very nicely.
Thank you.
Personally, I'm liking the Lightroom in a snap tip. So thank you for coming back and sharing something new with us tonight. Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Can you see me?
So let me, you know what? I cannot see. There you are. Okay. With that, and that clumsy little handover, I'm going to hand it to you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me back, first of all. I'm definitely appreciative of the opportunity to talk to everybody again. As Linda said, this is really, I haven't done a session like this before. My last one was very much about Lightroom and all the fun little tips and tricks I've got in there. And that's really what my YouTube channel has been focused around as well. But I don't want to just be the Lightroom guy. I want to be able to talk about my creative process and things in general. So as we go through this session, it's going to be centered around the things I did in Lightroom, but it's not about how I did them in Lightroom or why I did them in Lightroom versus Photoshop and things like that. So hopefully you'll be able to take the concepts that I talk about here, and whether you're a Photoshop user, a Lightroom user, an iPad, Lightroom user, Capture One, whatever, you should be able to take the concepts back and apply them to your own work as you hopefully learn how to better visualize or realize your vision from when you took the photo to that digital darkroom process. So with that, let me practice this before with Linda and Erin. So let's see if I actually get the shared screen piece correct here. So we need to be on screen 2, it should be. So fingers crossed. Actually, I think that's the one I need. You should see a beautiful cover slide.
There it is. Looks
great. There it is. All right.
Perfect.
And I took out my About Me part this time because I figured Linda would cover that. I think I might have to steal some of what you said, Linda. I think it's better stated than what I've put. And then I did this last time as well. And just a quick plug for Nature First Photography. It's a group of photographers that have signed on just to state their support of really leave no trace principles within nature and landscape photography. Very important to me. If you follow the news, you see, especially this year, so many people are going out into nature, not necessarily treating it the way we would like and leaving it better than how they found it. So just wanted to call this out. there's 7 main principles. Like I said, it's all really centered around leave no trace and leave it better than you found it. But especially as landscape photographers, where we're sharing locations that are near and dear to us, I feel very strongly about advocating for the protection of those areas as well. So it's my little, my little soapbox speech, and I'll move on from that. So what we'll be talking about here today is 4 key things. And the first one, expectations, is really just something I want to touch on at the beginning, just briefly, in terms of how I've learned to manage my expectations when I'm going out, whether it's on trips or local visits, what have you, to make sure I'm not getting myself so keyed in on a certain set of expectations that I can't see the broader forest for the trees, so to speak. How I take the time to find the scene and the moment around me, regardless of what the conditions are when I'm out in the field, recognizing what drew me into that scene or that moment, and then taking all of that visualization back into the digital darkroom and realizing it through my post-processing. So 4 key things, and I think we're going to be good on time, but I just want to kind of jump right into this. Linda, if you've got questions that pop up in the chat, I'd say let's kind of go with the flow and see how timing's going as to whether we table those for the end or if we answer them in real time. So with that, we'll jump right on in here. So speaking first of all, again, about expectations real quickly, everybody's different and how you operate best. I actually just had a slight conversation with Linda the other day about, for me, photography is very mindful and contemplative, and I like it to be my calming place away from all the craziness of the world, especially in 2020. Whereas I think we all know Linda well enough at this point. She's probably more the opposite end of the spectrum. So again, everybody's different, but for me, I used to get very hung up on going out for whether it was local trips or going somewhere like Colorado or Death Valley or whatever, and feeling like I've got to have these conditions, otherwise it's not going to be worth going. It's not going to be worth my time. Why even get the camera out, so on and so forth. And a lot of times I would get out there, and if I didn't have great conditions, I would almost kind of shut down because, well, I don't have beautiful clouds and amazing skies. So what's the point of taking a shot of tunnel view if you don't have an amazing, array of colors in the sky or whatever the case may be? Or what if I'm at sunset and there's no brilliant light and color like we have here? And it would really kind of just shut me down if I didn't have perfectly clear skies at night. Why shoot it? You're not going to get everything you want when you've got clouds drifting through the scene. But it's about embracing less of the expectations and more of the moment and how you adapt and find those opportunities when you're out in the field. So what do we do when things don't go as we expect? Forgetting about I have to have the perfect conditions, or I need to have this in order to feel like I'm going to have an opportunity to shoot what I want. I must go here and see this and do that. Otherwise, it's a ruined trip. It's a loss of a trip. Maybe that's just kind of the journey I went through, but it really did make it more difficult for me to just find myself in the moment, slow down, maybe pause for a bit, and then start exploring and looking around and saying, okay, yeah, it would have been great to have that, but I don't. So what am I going to do differently to take advantage of the opportunity and find something maybe even more unique and different than going to tunnel view and just having the tourist shot, excuse me, of, Half Dome and El Capitan and the valley and everything that millions of other people have taken. So that's my soapbox about expectations. It's something that I think as I've progressed more in my journey, I've probably gotten further and further away from those expectations. And it's probably a little tougher when you're early in your photographic journey because you're still trying to figure out your camera settings and composition and everything. So having some set expectations maybe is a little bit of a safety net. But again, for me, it really tripped me up when I'd get out there and those expectations weren't met. So I did want to speak to that and hopefully see how, or show you how throughout the rest of this presentation that kind of ties into, especially this first image that we'll go through, how I didn't get the conditions I had hoped for, but because I wasn't so locked in on expectations, I was able to pivot and look for those other opportunities. So the first thing I would say is don't shut down, find the scene, find the moment that draws your attention, and then recognize why that drew you in. So let's talk about my recent trip to Colorado. Back in the last few days of July, early August, I went out to Colorado. And again, I was very hopeful that I would have a certain set of conditions and, great clouds and light and, golden hour and sunrise, sunset and all that. But as it turned out, these are the conditions I got. These are actually some of the better conditions I got for the week and a half I was there. So, in the past, I might have gotten there and maybe I wouldn't even taken the camera out because, well, gosh, there's really no light. And again, these clouds here were actually somewhat more interesting than what I had for much of the trip where it was just flat gray. But this is where I had to pivot and adapt and slow down and take a moment and just really explore. And I had my dog with me, so just sat on the beach for a little while and just scanned around me, stood up and turned 360 degrees, walked a little way down that way, little ways down that way, just to see what is out there that I don't have great light, but what can I do with this? And again, where can I find a different opportunity to find a shot that maybe I wouldn't have even considered if the conditions were more ideal or perfect or, whatever the case may be. And that's where I honed in on this little area right here. It doesn't look like a whole lot, but I saw this little piece and it drew me in. So I took the time to ask the question of why is this drawing me in? What could I potentially do with this? And in this particular case, it broke down to pulling out my long lens. I think this was a 200 millimeter shot and honing in on this one small area. And you saw in that previous slide, it was in the grand scheme of things of what was surrounding me, it was a postage stamp size area of my surroundings, but I found some interest here. It was also where I was able to begin visualizing immediately what about it drew me in, what caught my eye, and explore that a little bit more. So from the moment I found it at that 200 millimeters, I knew that the triangular shape of the trees was drawing me in and had some interest in some details there that kind of, again, caught my eye and pulled me a little bit. Also, that curvature of the little bit of a clearing in the grass around those trees helped them stand out a little bit more. But also all the little highlights within the trees themselves. There wasn't great light, but still within those trees and the shadows of the branches, it had all these little differences of highlight and shadow, that I felt I could probably do something with that within the digital darkroom. And again, for me, that's Lightroom, but might be Photoshop or whatever the case may be for you. And then lastly, as I was looking at the scene on the back of my camera, as I took some test shots, even as I tried to drag that exposure time out as much as I could without putting a filter on, I readily realized I did not like the choppiness and the texture of the water, because I felt like there's so much texture in the background of the scene with the pine trees that it was just kind of making the whole scene very busy and taking away the opportunity for the eye to really hone in on that center part of center part of the scene that, again, drew me in from the get-go. So I knew right away there were a few things that I wanted to do while I was on site, as well as when I got back to the computer and started working on the image. So at that point, I did throw on a neutral density filter, and that allowed me to extend my exposure time out to 30 full seconds and really smooth out that water, other than the bug that decided to land on my lens. Took away pretty much all of that texture in the water. So now I'm already visualizing again, okay, I've got the prior shot where I've got all the texture in the trees. On this one, I didn't want to use this as a single frame because there was a little bit of a breeze. And if I zoom in, you can tell that some of the branches had shifted just a little bit in that 30 seconds. So it's not quite as sharp, but I could take that little strip of smooth water that I've got there now and combine it in Photoshop, blend them together, and come out with the end image that I'd already been visualizing from the moment that this really pulled me in. And from there, it comes down to how do I realize that vision through my digital darkroom process, i.e. the making of the image. So I found the scene, I recognized what drew me in. Now I'm going to pull all that back out so that I can help you as the viewer see that vision as well. So my first steps that I generally do when I go into the digital darkroom, I apply my lens corrections. I do a quick crop and alignment. In this case, I didn't do any cropping other than aligning. The shoreline was just a little off kilter. And a little mini soapbox, please, for the love of all you care about in this world, make sure your shorelines, your horizon lines are level. There's nothing that draws the eye kind of away from what you really want noticed. than a crooked horizon or something crooked when it should be straight. So again, little soapbox rant. And I took care of that little bug that had landed on my screen or on my lens as well. But again, not a whole lot done in this particular image. Next step, and the first big step I'd taken, is when I was in the field, I knew right away that I didn't have great light. It was relatively monotone in terms of the colors in the scene. The water and the trees were all kind of generally that kind of bluish green. So I knew right away when I was still in Colorado and taking the shot that I was going to do this one in black and white. And there's two reasons for that. Is A, if it's monotone or monochrome, generally I tend to prefer going black and white in that case anyways, depending on the circumstances. But generally speaking, also just from a personal aesthetic standpoint, I feel much more comfortable going a little bit more on the creative end of the spectrum when I'm doing my post-processing. And as we go through this, I don't go really crazy on this one or anything, but it's still much more aggressive of an adaptation of the light as it really was than what I would typically do with my color work, where I tend to try to keep it a little bit closer to what I really saw while still pulling in the emotions of being there and on the scene. So on this one, I found a good black and white profile that kind of pulled out some of those highlights in the trees that I was talking about earlier, gave that foreground, the open land, a little bit more contrast to the overall scene. And then I did a little bit more aggressive adjustments in the basic panel. And again, I don't want to get into the individual sliders, but trying to, I use the term prepping my canvas. So kind of, if you're a painter, I don't know, my girlfriend does crafts and painting and things, and she's always talking about prepping canvases. I don't really know what that means other than I think it's painting them with a base layer and you're good to go. So I use that in my mind for I'm prepping my canvas in the digital darkroom. So a lot of times that means I'm actually reducing contrast and flattening the image a little bit because I want to be very specific about where I'm going back in and painting in the contrast and if I'm doing a color image, the specific colors and saturation and things like that I want, as opposed to having it globally kind of all popped and in your face. I'm going to kind of tone it down a little bit and then bring it back out with my local adjustments and brushes and things like that. I apply a tone curve typically, and again, I'm going through this in the order that I typically process for a few reasons. For one, as a Lightroom user, kind of a lot of these are Adobe recommends you start here. So from a standpoint of prepping that canvas, I want to make sure I've got the crop that I'm going to use. I want to make sure things are level again. Also, if I do have a lot of spot healing I need to do, typically that's going to work best when you do it very early on in the process before you start doing a lot of adjustments. And if you wait until later in the process, it can actually become rather ineffective if you really get into a lot of heavier editing and things like that. So anyways, at this point of the game, I would typically go into my tone curve and start using this to do more refined control of the contrast of the image, still with the mindset of I'm prepping the canvas, but I'm starting to go into paint mode a little bit. Now also keep in mind that as I was pulling these out of Lightroom, this is where I ended up with the tone curve. So typically as I'm working on an image, I'll do an adjustment on the tone curve. And then as I work through my further steps, I might go back into the tone curve panel and tweak it and adjust it as I've made other adjustments and I realize that I need to tweak things a little bit further back on the tone curve or the basic panel or whatever the case may be. My primary goal here was I added in a little bit of, I didn't add in, I actually reduced the contrast a little bit on this. I didn't want to really have a lot of pure blacks in the image, so I actually pulled that baseline level of the blacks up so that no matter what I do throughout the rest of my processing, I'm not going to get into a pure black. It was just kind of the aesthetic I wanted to go for. So that was really my main goal with this tone curve step. And you can see here, and much of what we'll be looking at here tonight is all of these adjustments are really, for the most part, very subtle in and of themselves, but it's when they're combined with everything else that the whole image starts to really change and adapt, and some of that emotion comes in. And I'm helping realize, again, that vision I had in the field, and I'm pulling that out of the image. But other than a few steps here and there, for the most part, from stage to stage, you're going to see pretty subtle differences. And especially I realize on Zoom, these may look completely identical, but trust me, there are some subtle differences here. But I would encourage you as you go through your processing, try not to take too big of a leap in a single step unless it's a very considered and intentional leap and not just swinging a slider or making just a huge adjustment in Photoshop, whatever, because you want to be thoughtful and controlled about what you're doing. So a lot of what I do is subtle, and I might go back and tweak and then subtly make some changes and then go back and tweak, as I was just talking about, for instance, with that tone curve. But those subtle changes as you work through the image add up and add up and add up to get you to that final point.
Somebody's I'm sorry, Michael,
Yeah.
asking, so since we're talking about these trees, he's asking, why are there white spots on the trunks of some of those pines? Is that, you know?
I'm going to assume that, so there was some mixed in, it's a little hard to tell, especially so probably on Zoom, but some of those are dead trees where I assume the bark is just starting to come off of them. Maybe a tree fell and hit them, whatever, but it's just exposed, what do you call it? Not heartwood, but the bark is gone off of them. And that's something I actually try to control as I get further into the editing process. So, yeah. Good.
Yeah, we just wanted to make sure it was something that you hadn't done.
No, that's all Mother Nature on that one. It does annoy me a bit though. So, all right, so moving in here, I did some black and white adjustments in terms of the color sliders on black and white. So, if you're thinking of Ansel Adams as an example in film photography, it's kind of like applying a color filter for your black and white outcome. So in this case, I knew that those brightest points of the tree branches that I mentioned earlier that give some of that additional texture in the trees, those leaned more in the yellow and green range on the image, whereas the deeper shadows were more green and blue. So by lifting up the yellow and green on my black and white adjustments, I'm adding, again, just a little subtle additional pop to those highlights in the trees and pulling that detail out a little bit. And when you look at the comparison in this slide here, again, it's subtle, but hopefully on Zoom, you can still see that the little tips, the highlights on the trees are a little bit brighter, and where you can see a bigger difference is in the ground specifically, because that was a lot of yellow and green with the grass on that little slope. So as I lifted those sliders, I brought out that ground a little bit too. Now in this next one, this is where I do take a big leap. It's not a subtle change at all, but again, it's with thought and intent, because I know it's setting kind of the ground for things I'm going to continue to do. So on this next slide here, I went in and I applied some radial adjustments. So this is where I'm really starting to think about, I know that in my mind and when I was on the scene, my focus was on that curved kind of clearing that I pointed out earlier, and the texture, especially in those foreground trees and those triangular shapes in those foreground trees. So I want to make sure my viewer's focus is being pulled to the center. This is a very center-heavy image. There's really not much interest on the right third or the left third. It's all in the center. So I want to make sure I'm pulling the viewer in. So the first thing I did, I brightened the center of the frame. Obviously here it's much, much brighter than what we saw in the previous example. Really pretty straightforward. It was exposure and a lot of, actually less exposure and highlight, focus on highlights, and a lot of focus on the whites, because again, the white slider in this case was pulling out those highlight details all that much more. And then I did a little bit of a controlled vignette, and I call it a controlled vignette just because I wasn't using the built-in vignette tool. So I've got complete control over the sliders. And again, it was an exposure drop. I think I dropped the shadows a little bit, but I actually lifted the whites because I didn't want to lose too much of the detail on the edges. I wanted it faded out, but I didn't want to draw it down completely. But by using that radial adjustment here or local adjustment layer, whatever, again, you've got that controlled intent behind it as opposed to just applying a global vignette and only having some relatively limited control over it. Sometimes on the vignettes as well, on the radial adjustment vignettes, on the outer edges, not only am I darkening them down, but I'll also sometimes go negative on the texture slider or clarity. So I'm actually reducing the sharpness a little bit. And I might actually pull out the saturation as well if it's a color image. Again, not going to be one size fits all for every single image, but it's a little trick I do, again, to make sure I'm drawing the viewer's attention to where there's the most color, the most texture, the most detail, the most light, whatever the case may be. So that's really what I'm talking about when I say a controlled vignette. It gives me all that option to control the viewer's eye through that vignette process and with some different options within that. So obviously here, the before and after the radial adjustments is significant. Now I'm going to start getting that back under control a little bit. So First thing I did is I went in and I applied some gradient adjustments. And let me try this here. Can you see the little laser pointer?
Yeah.
So it might lag. I've never done this on a Zoom thing, but I figured I'd give it a try. So on the top here, with this adjustment, I darkened the top third of the frame. So really, if you look just above this part, you can see it's starting to fade into the distance a little bit, or give it a little bit more depth, as well as helping that center part of the frame be more of the focal point. And then with the bottom one down the very bottom here, I just darkened the very, very bottom edge. I want to make sure I'm keeping the frame grounded so that the viewer's eye isn't having a tendency to kind of slide as I cover my face here. The viewer eye isn't having a tendency to slide off the bottom of the frame and fall out of the scene. So relatively straightforward adjustments there. Before and after, again, another subtle adjustment, but you can see again, those trees are fading off a little bit more than they are on the before example. To me, that's adding some depth into the image as well. It's a relatively flat image, not just in terms of light, but also within the terms of depth. So by darkening that, it kind of gives it the sense that they're fading into the background as opposed to being up close and personal. And then I went in here again and I did some more brush adjustments to really call out the highlights more on those tree branch tips. I felt that there was still some opportunity there. So I just did a local brush adjustment and really focused on only these main trees that are in the foreground here. I didn't do it on the background trees because again, that's not where I want the eye to go. But on those main trees that I consider, kind of as I was working on it, I was thinking it was a family. You've got the two parents in the middle and the kids kind of standing off to the side a little bit, maybe some grandchildren on the outskirts with these real small trees. But I want that to be the focus again. So drawing some more detail out in that. But also I felt on that prior example, let me back up here, I felt that the ground was getting too much. And actually your eye was being pulled more towards the bright ground with the other adjustments I had done. So on that second brush adjustment that's kind of hidden in here, I just really drew the highlights down, a little bit negative exposure, little negative highlights to get that back under control so it wasn't kind of blasting in the face. When I don't want people worried about the ground, I want them worried about the trees that are standing within that clearing. So again, before and after, you can see especially the difference between the before on the ground where it's very bright and bold and much more subdued here. And then again, I'm hoping in Zoom, you can see that there's some more detail on these patriarch trees, family trees, whatever you want to call them, where the tips of those branches are standing out just a little bit more. And then on this one, I actually did some global adjustments again. So I kind of went back to the starting point. I don't often do global texture, dehaze, or clarity, except for in woodland scenes. I actually like to add in some negative texture, especially to kind of soften it. My personal preference, I just feel like, especially with pine trees like this, it gets very sharp or crunchy looking when you've got all that texture and detail in there. So I actually pulled that out a little bit. And in this case, I added some dehaze in Lightroom to kind of get the overall luminance a little bit more evened out and under control. And this is a little bit trial and error. I could have done this with local adjustments. I could have done it through probably some different means, but I found that the dehaze slider kind of got me to where I want. So that's another piece here, is play around and try different things so that you're not just honed in on, I'm only using exposure, I'm only using highlights and shadows, whatever. Just try it, see what you like. You can always undo it. So again, before and after, you can see it's brought down some of the, what I would call hot spots and the highlights a little bit, maybe lifted those blacks a little bit, so it's balanced it out. There's not quite the contrast that there was before, but I found it more aesthetically pleasing. Now where you're going to see a big jump is this next one. What in the world did I just do? So this is not the same image. This is now where I shifted over to my long exposure. And really, I'm just worried about the water here. I know I'm going to blend these two together. So I'm getting the water to the point where I think it's going to look right with all the work I just did on that other image. Match the color profile, in this case, the black and white profile. I darkened it down, but I also lifted the whites because I kind of liked the white streaks that had come out with the long exposure. And then I did a slight global vignette here as well because I knew I had that vignette on the other image. So I wanted to make sure that this would kind of tie into it and have those darker corners a little bit from the vignette process. So now I've got my first image that was just the regular exposure and that long exposure, but all I'm worried about on each of these really, and you'll notice when I walked to that first one, I didn't talk about the water at all. That's because I wasn't worried about that water. So I was focused solely on this upper part of the frame, and then this one, just the water. And I know I'm going to go into Photoshop and blend them together. And I come out with this. So this is what, as I was standing there on the shore of the lake shooting and looking at the scene and thinking about what would look to my eye great through the digital process, this is what I had envisioned right from the get-go, was the focus on those trees and that little clearing the most. The water is smoothed out so that it's not quite so much texture in the scene. Hopefully it's going to help keep that attention on that center part of the frame. When I got everything blended in here, I did do some more tweaks. I reduced the highlights in the water a little bit because I felt the white streaks were pulling a little bit too much attention. Pulled down the highlights in the ground again because I felt still it was a little too hot. And then I also did just a little bit of darkening in the trees in the background. So brought that water down, brought the ground down, and then focused on the furthest trees in the background and just brought them down just a little bit with some local adjustments to get balance in the frame overall and make sure those two blended frames came together in one cohesive image. So now you've got the before and after of what it was when I came straight out of Photoshop, and then took it into Lightroom and did those final adjustments. So really at this point, I'm basically done with the image, but I'm going to put final image in quotes. Left side, obviously where I started, right side where I ended up. But at this point in my process, I'm stepping away. I'm taking a pause. For me, one of the biggest thing that I find of benefits is I used to go out, I'd finish an edit, and I'd immediately go out and share it. And then I'd hit post, and I'd go walk away, get a drink, have a snack, whatever, and then sit back and look at my phone and go, oh my gosh, I missed that. Or how did I miss that thing over there? Or, the colors are off, or the luminance is off, or it's too dark, it's too bright, whatever. So for me, and I know Linda, she chastises me about I should release photos more frequently and, and all that stuff. I see her laughing. But for me, I wait. I've got on my notes, wait at least a few hours. For me, there's images I'm sitting on months later. I've still got stuff in Yosemite that is edited and it's pretty well done, but I still go back every few weeks. And if I'm just kind of like, I don't know what image I want to work on, I'll go to that collection and I'll just find one and take a look at it again with fresh eyes. Especially in color images, your eyes get so burned in with the colors as you're staring at your screen for half hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever it might be. But even a black and white image like this, my eyes are totally adjusted to the luminance and the whites and the blacks in this image. So if I don't take that pause, and maybe you do just need to step away for half an hour and come back. But for me, I'll come back again and again and again. For me personally, I don't want to put anything out that I'm not certain I'm happy with. Now, maybe not everybody's trying to do this professionally and you're doing it for yourself, and that's fine. But, and I think Linda, you and I have had this conversation where it's a common thing. I hear this from a lot of people where, I shared it and I realized I totally missed there was, some spot in the sky in the upper corner that I was staring at that photo for hours. I never saw it. So again, you just kind of get blind to everything. So that's my, again, little soapbox throughout these things, but step away at least for a little bit and come back. Maybe not the extreme of me and waiting months and months, but I think the worst I did was like 12 months on something. But do take an opportunity to step away, kind of let your eyes reset, go watch TV, whatever the case may be, and then come back to it and see with fresh eyes, what do you think now? And actually, I would say that there are some things in this I just did this edit 4 days ago now. I'm not happy with some of those brighter points. I don't know who that was that asked about the brighter points in the trees, but I'd like to clean those up a little bit because I feel, especially in this little spot here, as my eye is working through the scene, that kind of tugs my eye a little bit, and that's not where I want the viewer's eye to go. There's a little brighter spot here. Yeah, there's a little one in there that I could probably go in and do either some clone stamping or just use exposure adjustments on those little bits to clean that up and make sure I'm controlling that viewer's eye. I think maybe actually I might have pulled the ground a little too dark. Maybe I can brighten that back up. So anyways, this has just been a few days and I'm already sitting here going, yeah, you know what? I want to tweak this, this, and this. So Linda, you want to pause and see if we got questions out there?
One question in here, and I want to see if you'll explain it a little bit for David.
Yeah.
This question is, can you explain the blending procedure in Photoshop? Can you hit on that fairly quickly or?
Yeah, man, it's kind of tough to just talk about it and not show it. But essentially, again, I'm working at a Lightroom for 99% of my stuff. So from Lightroom, you can right-click on the image and edit in Photoshop. So in this case, you would select both of the images in Lightroom or however many images you're trying to blend together in Photoshop, have them highlighted, right-click, edit in photo or open in Photoshop as layers. And then it's automatically going to pull them in and create layers for each frame that you've got selected. And from there, if you're familiar with layer mask, it's just a matter of masking it. And then in this case, it was masking the top layer and using a paint black brush to hide in this case, the choppy water and bring out that smooth water from the layer below it. Hopefully that helps. Like I said, it's kind of hard to explain it fully without showing it. But anything else?
No, all this, these wonderful, inspires me to do better editing. Lots of small adjustments makes magic. Yeah, just everybody's in awe. Keep going. Keep going.
Thank you. Inspires me to sit on an image for 2 years before I share it. All right, how are we on time? What do we got here?
So
okay.
No, 20 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're doing all right. So I wanted to walk through this black and white one. Like I said, I just edited this. It was very fresh in my mind. And this is a great example of tough conditions out in the field where we go back to those expectations at the beginning. This is where I know through what I can do in the digital darkroom, I knew I could pull something of interest, and hopefully you all find it interesting as well. But I love how this turned out. This is exactly what I had in my mind's eye, or the concept that I had in my vision when I was out in the field. And if this was in color and I was just standing out there going, okay, well, I'm only shooting color, I'm not doing any creative editing, woe is me, yada, yada, yada. I want to be sitting here right now looking at this and being pretty happy with how it turned out. So bringing it full circle on that expectation soapbox at the beginning. So let's move on. We'll talk about another opportunity. This is also going to be an image from Colorado, but the complete opposite, where I had pretty good conditions, and talking through the scene in the moment, what drew me in, et cetera, so that I could take that back to the digital darkroom again. So this one is a completed image. If you follow me on social media, I released this one, I think 2 weeks ago. I call it Parting Kiss. It's the last little kiss of sunlight in the trees as I was sitting at the campground one evening when it finally, thank goodness, stopped raining after 6 straight days of rain. But again, I was in a scenario where I'm sitting at the campsite after a day of being out and exploring, and actually a pretty good day. We had some nice big puffy clouds and deep blue skies and all that. Pretty worn out, but I'm sitting there as we're waiting to get dinner ready and all that. And I look across our campsite and the service road we were by, and there's just this gorgeous light hitting the far mountain slope. And I don't think I'm too unique, and I love light coming through leaves, backlit leaves. I just absolutely love the way that looks, especially in the spring, and this kind of reminded me of that with the light greens of the aspen trees. So I'm sitting there, and immediately I found my moment, my scene, and I just had to look around and find the right representation of that I knew I could then take back into Lightroom or the digital process and bring my viewer along on that emotional journey, that trip with me, whatever you want to call it. So scanning around, looking at the different scenes, and again, everything that was calling to me were these backlit aspen trees, and trying different compositions, and exhausted, but making myself get up out of the camp chair and grab my tripod and actually walk around and find different angles. So, this lower right one, the tree in the foreground was kind of in my way. So that's not going to work. Just keep working the area, walk around, try different heights, get low, get high, whatever the case may be, to find the composition that finally clicks with you, that gives you the opportunity you want. And again, this is somewhere where I've personally grown a lot, where I used to roll up on something and go, oh, I love that light, snap, and I'd move on. And I like that light over there, snap. And I'd end up with 100 shots of kind of the same thing. But when I get back to the computer, I was happy with maybe 1 or 2 of them. So maybe I needed to be a little bit more deliberate and thoughtful in the moment. Again, find the moment, find the scene, and then recognize what's drawing me in and hone in on that as I look for my composition. And I found this. So what struck me here is, this is the raw file, so it's going to be very dull and flat, but I knew what I could do with it. And also it's not just that I had the beautiful, sunlight, again, the parting kiss of the sunlight on the aspen leaves, but I loved the stark white trunks standing out. And some of those other examples I showed, there were little slivers of the trunks visible, but maybe there was other distracting things in front of them or whatever. So I found this composition where it let me hone in on that light, as well as the beautiful, again, I don't think I'm an exception on this, but I love the way some stark white aspen trunks look, especially when they're mixed in with other darker pine trees and things like that right now. So this was my scene. This was my moment. This is what I knew I was going to be working with. So again, I went into, now I've got that visualized in my mind. It was almost a month later that I was at the computer to sit down and finally work on it. But I had that visualization so much in my mind that I was able to recall it as I sat down to work. I don't always wait that long, but it's 2020. Life's been crazy. All right, so same starting point as before. I apply my lens correction. I do my crop and alignment, do some calibration in Lightroom. If you're not familiar with calibration, especially that blue saturation on the calibration panel. Just a little pro tip, if you play with that slider, it's kind of like a subtle saturation boost, but it's not as muddy or just universal as the saturation slider. So if you haven't played with that, definitely give it a try. But the biggest thing I did here is I changed this from the out of camera 2x3 crop to a 4x5. And there's really, as we go to the next piece here of the before and after, the other thing, it's kind of similar to what I was saying when I'm looking for the composition, is what's drawing me in, what's the scene, what's the moment, what's the emotion. This stuff over here doesn't really do anything for what I want this image to be about. There's another pretty brightly lit pine tree over here that all that's going to do is draw the eye away. I've got some other brighter highlights up here that kind of do sneak into the final crop, but I know I can work with those. There's some dead trees here that aren't going to do anything for me in terms of what I'm trying to help the viewer see and feel and all that. So get rid of it. You don't need it. Chop it off. So in this case, I went with a simple 4x5 crop. And then I got down into spot healing. And I know a lot of people don't do a whole lot of healing within Lightroom. And admittedly, it's not as powerful and robust as what you can do in Photoshop or some other software programs out there. Sorry, I've got a hair on my face. But I think I said it in my last session as well, is I'm well known for being stubborn, and gosh darn it, I'm going to show that you can do it in Lightroom. Plus, I just don't like bouncing back and forth between different things. So I've got a ton of spot healing here. So if you look at the prior slide here with the before and after this crop, I've got this nasty mess of unfocused dead branches that were closer to me than the rest of these scenes. So they're just, again, this blurry mess. I got to do something about that. So I did a whole bunch of spot healing in that, and I get all into the weeds. I'm creating a spot heal over here and then dragging it because you can't overlap them and all this crazy stuff. But anyways, the key point is get rid of that clutter, get it out of your viewer scene. I'm also going through, it's probably, some of these are really, really tiny and probably a little OCD, but I've got little spot heals. I've got one here. I've got one here, and they're all over the place. Anything where there was a kind of a hot, bright point coming through, I got rid of it. I just spot healed it out because I don't want the viewer's eye getting stuck on something that I don't want them looking. I want them looking at the beautiful light on the trees and the tree trunks. I don't need their eye getting caught because there's some little hint of an aspen trunk somewhere back over there and it's brightly lit, and now their eye's going to get tugged and it's dangling the car keys in front of the cat or whatever, and they go chasing it. And before and after. So again, you can see I've cleaned up that out of focus blurry mess down here. I've gotten rid of some other hot spots. And again, I realize on Zoom, it's probably hard to see. And I actually thought of that. So I circled the main key things I zoomed in, or I honed in on the spot heal or clean up, prep the canvas, whatever you want to call it. I didn't like this little branch down here that was really close to intersecting the trunk at the very edge of the frame, which it's just kind of pulling your eye out. Maybe I would have left it if it wasn't a broken branch, but it was a broken branch, so it also didn't go anywhere. So I just nixed that, got rid of it, and cleaned that up. One of the biggest things I do, and a lot of times I don't necessarily catch all this until I'm further in the image or the edit process, but watch for things, especially on the edges of your frames, that are going to pull that eye out. So in this case, they're not big in this example, but there were two little hot spots. So there's a little bright patch of sunlight coming through the foliage here, a little bit there. There were some others scattered around, but those are the two main ones I wanted to call out for this example. Take an opportunity to clean those up. Also, a big tip is if you're working on a white background, do that, but then flip it to a black background, because you're going to find things that the white is hiding, especially if it is a bright spot on the edge of your frame. Your eye's less likely to see that when you've got a bright white background. I do all of my editing on the middle medium gray setting, but as I go through this, and especially as I'm doing my dodging and burning or darkening and brightening of sections, and this edge patrol, border patrol, you hear all different terms for it, I'll switch around between white, black, and that medium gray to see if, as I switch from background to background, is there anything else that I'm noticing now, because it's a different contrast between what's in the actual image. So I always go through and I look at those edges real closely. And then again, I had some brighter spots just within the image. There's some little bright highlights in here where the sunlight was popping through that I felt was tugging the eye a little bit. A little white aspen branch darting off horizontally, or this is a very vertical scene, so I didn't want anything cutting across it like that. Even though it's small, it's still kind of contrary to the overall vibe, especially as bright as it was. And then there's a little hot spot on this aspen tree back here, where for the most part that tree's in shadow, but just that little jut out of the knob on the tree was catching the sunlight. And again, a hot spot that's going to catch the eye and pull your viewer away. And then now I've really got the canvas kind of, I can't even say the canvas is fully prepped if I'm going back to that analogy, but the first phase of it is, at least I've got it sized and trimmed the way I want it. We can say that. But now I'm going to go in and again, start layering in kind of my baseline edits that I want to do globally before I go in and do most of my work with local adjustments, which whether it's Photoshop and you're doing layers to do specific areas, brushes, radial adjustments in Lightroom, graduated filters, anything like that. Use your local adjustments to home in on the areas you specifically want to work on, so you're not just doing a global wash over everything. Main adjustment here was finding a color profile. I used the Adobe color profile just as kind of a starting point. I warmed up the image overall a little bit. And then almost always on these, I pull the contrast down. I mentioned that in the first image as well. I want to be very deliberate about where the contrast in the image is. And I find that Lightroom's default of 0 is a little contrast heavy for my liking. So I usually pull it down anywhere from 15 to 30 points to kind of, again, flatten the image out overall. And then I'll go in with my local adjustments and bring that contrast back where I really want it. So the before and after, you can see it's a sizable difference, but overall still relatively subtle considering it's the basic panel. So everything I did here was globally applied to the entire image. It's not a real drastic change, but you're starting to see those colors come out a little bit more, the warmth of the image come out a little bit more. Again, I'd go into the tone curve, and in this case, I did bring in some contrast, whereas in the previous one, I pulled it out, but I did still bring that black point up so that my minimum black point or my darkest darks weren't going to be pure black if there was any in the scene, especially as warm and bright as this scene really is, especially the part of the scene that I want my viewer focused on. I didn't want any just black points in it. So I brought that up a little bit so the blacks, no matter what I do, don't go fully black in the image. And then I did boost the highlights a little bit in the upper part of that curve as well. Again, subtle change, but you do see, hopefully on Zoom, that there is a little bit of a difference in the contrast from the before and after on that tone adjustment. Give me 5 seconds, I'm gonna wet my whistle. All right. Moving on further, still doing global adjustments here. I did make some adjustments on the HSL panel, or hue, saturation, luminance. Don't worry about what these sliders are. Again, this is just showing you the tools I used, but really what I did mostly here, I did boost some of the saturation in those leaves, but I also adjusted the hue a little bit to take them a little bit more towards a warmer orange and less of a yellow-green. Again, I boosted those saturations a bit, and I also cooled down the shadows a little bit. So if I was on the hue slider, I actually pulled some of the green and the blue further into that end of the spectrum. So I had a better contrast. And again, in this scene, a little trick, and you can do it in Photoshop as well, but you've got the little target tool here. If you click that and then drag your cursor around the image, it's going to tell you on the sliders which colors are actually in that part of the image. So I know that my shadows, like in this pine tree here is an example. In my mind, I'm thinking it's a green tree, but really it's a blue tree from a slider standpoint. So using that to help control highlights and shadows and the tonality of them, and then also doing some split toning on those areas as well. So again, warming up the highlights, cooling down the shadows, and then finding the balance of where I want the overall scene. But still fairly subtle because these are global adjustments, and I don't want to go too wild here because it's going to impact everything in the scene as opposed to impacting the part that I really want the viewer to be looking at. So again, subtle difference between those. Where you do see the little bit of difference, again, the edge of the brightest part of the trees is a little bit warmer, a little bit more orange. And if you look at that pine tree, I called that as a blue tree, not a green tree. Again, it might be kind of hard to see, but it actually, I took the luminance down on the blues a little bit, so it's a little bit darker. And the green is a little bit more blue in that. So again, with your color tones in an image, your warmer tones are going to come out of the scene at you, whereas your cooler tones are going to fade more into the background of the scene. So you can, again, a way to control the viewer's eye as you're working on your editing and thinking about what do you want them focused on, what brought you into the scene, what pulled you in, what drew you in. You can use those color tones of the color temperature as a way to control that as well. And then we start getting into the bigger adjustments again with local adjustments, where I'm going to be very targeted on specific areas in the image. So if we go back to where we were on the right side here, you can see this is still fairly subtle, but there is a fairly big difference here in that I added in some soft glow light up here. Sometimes I do this when it doesn't really exist. In this case, it was there, and you think about driving into the sun and it's glaring and flaring all over in your windshield. Or I'm sure you've all seen it probably in your camera lens where you just get that kind of hazed sun glow effect. I was actually using my hand to block that out because I was worried about getting actual, the stereotypical lens flares throughout the image. So I blocked that out so I didn't capture it, but it was there. So I wanted to bring that in because that was one of the things that drew me into the scene as well. So I used a radial adjustment up here, lifted the blacks, used a warm tone to really bring in some of that sun glow. In the middle here, I applied a controlled vignette. We talked through that already. In this case, it's offset. My main focal point of this image isn't dead center like the last image, so I want my vignette offset. I can't do that with the global vignette tool within Lightroom. Upper left, I actually darkened that corner a little bit. I felt that the highlights were a little too strong still on the edges of those pine trees, so I wanted to draw that down a bit so my viewer's eye, the viewer's eye isn't going up into the upper left and out of the image. And then same thing with the bottom right. It's just not an interesting part of the scene. It looks okay after I did the spot correction or spot healing. There's still nothing interesting. There's no light. So I'm going to draw that down a little bit darker because I don't want the viewer to even be worried about that part. That's not what I'm trying to show them and make them feel. So before and after, again, still fairly subtle, but the biggest difference you're going to notice is that this kind of hazy glow effect is into the image now. And if you do look on the left side, much brighter here in the highlights versus the after the radial adjustments. And the eye is a little less drawn to this boring corner down here because now the luminance is much more in line with the rest of the bottom of the image. It's more in line with that pine tree that I've pointed out a couple times and the background in general. So you're less likely to look over there. With the gradient filters, I didn't do or the graduated filters, I didn't do a whole lot on this one. I did use this dot here to darken roughly the left third. It was at a slight angle, so roughly through here, fading out to nothing and then getting darker as we work towards that lower left, again, to bring the eye in, but also kind of looking at it as, in my mind, when I was looking at the scene and looking at the image after the fact, I'm thinking of those aspen leaves as catching the light. They're absorbing all the light, they're glowing, they're really being drawn out. So I want that to be represented. And by darkening that kind of lower left third of the frame, I'm letting in the image I've got captured here, I'm letting that light get caught in the trees and then fade out as it goes further away. And then what I did off on the left here, and I don't do this real often, but a little trick in Lightroom, since you can't do a full layer, really, the only way to do it is with a graduated filter. If you're in Photoshop, you could do this with just a simple layer. But I used an out-of-frame gradient that's very narrow so that it's fully at 100% well before it hits the image to add a soft glow to the highlights. So again, I tend to like my woodland scenes a little softer anyways, but I also wanted to emphasize the sense of light glowing in those aspen leaves. So I did a little bit of negative texture, negative clarity, boosted the highlights a little bit, but also brought down the shadows. But then also what I did is I went in and I erased that mask, that layer, that graduated filter, whatever you're using. I deleted or erased it out of the tree trunks because I don't want the tree trunks to be soft and glowy. What I loved about the trunks was the brilliant white and the detail of the black eyes on the aspen trunks and all that. So I don't want that effect there. So again, thinking through everything very deliberately and what you're doing as you're working on your images. So before and after, again, not a huge difference. The biggest thing you're going to see here is there is a little bit of softness, a little bit of a sense of glow in those brightest aspen leaves to reinforce that warm parting kiss of light coming in the late afternoon sun.
So there's one question I'm going to, well, right there at the top left. Egidio is asking, what was the rationale for keeping that aspen trunk on the upper left corner?
As opposed to cloning it out or something, I'll assume.
He says you did not think it was distracting, it appears. So maybe to him it is. Yeah, and I would say I think, and I'm so far away from the final image right now that in my mind's eye I might have a skew, but I think I do tone it down a little bit more as I go further into this. Yeah. But also I kind of liked it. I felt it added a little bit sense of, there's more out there than just these two. There's others around here, but these are the two I want to tell the story about. And to follow up, he came back and said, as opposed to darkening it a little. So basically. Yeah. And when we get to the last couple of slides and the starting point with the raw file and where I ended up, I actually did darken a lot. So again, I've got that graduated filter on the left third that's darkening it down. I've got that, I'm pointing at my screen like you can see me. Let me use my laser pointer. I've got that graduated filter darkening this, angled left third roughly. I had that radial filter up here that I used to darken. So it's still there, but like I said, I kind of like just that little hint of something else peeking out. But it is darkened. I don't know that I would say significantly because I'm not doing anything drastic here, but it is darkened from where it started out. And okay, let me get caught back. So moving on to, sorry, did that answer the question? I think so. Okay. If not Egidio, he says yes. Okay. And then moving into this further on the brush adjustments, I used a brush up here with some negative dehaze to add a little bit more of that glow and a little bit atmosphere into the scene. I added some further highlights and added warmth just on these outer edges of the leaves, the lightest green of the green leaves, yellow leaves, greenish yellow, whatever you want to call it. I went in and then I went through, I did that kind of locally but globally on the green leaves, but then I went in also and there were some hot spots in those leaves after I brightened them up. Generally speaking, I went in and very specifically pulled those back down because I was losing a little bit of detail. They were getting too bright and you were losing too much texture in them. So I pulled down some of the hot spots throughout the image. And then I pulled out those aspen trunks in the foreground even more. And again, I feel that by doing this, I boosted the whites on these, darkened the blacks to really bring in some contrast on those trunks that also captures your eye a lot more than this one kind of hiding, peeking out in the background over there on the left, upper left. And then I took a broader brush and kind of just through this area in general, I did a little bit of a cooler temperature brush in on the shadowed areas of the image. So before and after brush, again, fairly subtle, but you can especially see on the tree trunks here, the aspen trunks, that's where I really made those pop out and stand out to the viewer more than what they were before. And to me, actually, I think just looking at the before and after here,
I feel that this is probably more prominent just in this frame compared to this frame, because now these are so bold in the scene. It's just your eyes locked into that. Hopefully, that's what I saw.
Beautiful.
Now we get to the raw versus the final. Again, the biggest difference here was cropping off that entire left side by going to the 4x5 crop. But that aspect back there, again, is fairly darkened down from what it was. But all of this is much more powerful in the scene than what those are anyways. And again, it's personal preference. If you don't like it, get rid of it. It's my image. I'm not going to get rid of it. But yeah, I mean, all of that is, and I would say that's a big thing here too, is this is how I do it. I'm hoping what you take from this is not how to edit like Michael Rung or process your images by Michael Rung, but understand more of the thought process and how I'm deliberate about it and thoughtful about it. And again, thinking back to when I was in the field and what I visualized there, and how I'm bringing that back into the digital side of the equation, not because I want everybody's images to look like mine, but I want you to be more thoughtful as you're out shooting and then coming back and working on the computer as well. And then the very last thing I did to call this one finished is on this one, I actually did go back and I added just a real subtle global vignette using the built-in vignette tool just to kind of bound the image in the frame a little bit more. I just felt it looked complete and finished in that regard. And this one, again, I let it sit for, I want to say at least a week and going back in and tweaking it. And this one, I worked really a lot with saturation and, is it too green? Is it too yellow? Did I add too much orange? So just coming back again with fresh eyes over and over again, letting it sit and making those little tweaks before saying, okay, now I'm good. I'm going to bless it and put it on Instagram and make it official. And that is what I've got. Look at that. I'm like right on, almost right on the button.
Want to stop sharing your screen?
Yep. Let me get back over to the right screen.
Last minute questions? Anybody? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions.
So either everybody got their questions answered or everybody's asleep. So I'll go with the first one.
No, I don't think people are. I do think you're going to want to see the chat, and I'll save that for you.
All right.
So I think any parting words, Michael, before I shut you down?
No, again, I think, the biggest areas where that have helped me progress the most the last few years, and I've only been shooting with a real camera for 5.5 years. So, I mean, all of this is a fairly truncated timeline, but especially the last 18 to 24 months is being, for me, and again, I'm going to say it again, this is what works for me. I'm not dictating that this is what you must do to be a good photographer, great photographer, happy photographer, whatever. But for me, being more deliberate and thoughtful in the act of finding the scene, finding the moment, recognizing what drew me in. And I know I'm just repeating that slide, but that's what I'm doing in the field is what is drawing me in and how can I start visualizing about it before I even click the shutter to say, that's the scene, that's the composition I want, because I know I can go into Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever and make it into what I'm seeing right now. So just think through that stuff while you're shooting. Running and gunning is fine. Again, there's nothing wrong with it, but I feel that you're going to end up not finding the best opportunity. You're just going to find a bunch of maybe pretty good opportunities. So think about it and find the best opportunities.
Yeah, and I'll admit, I'm a run and gunner, but shooting with you, shooting with John Fischer, shooting with, I think Rob Doyle's in this room, watching you guys process makes me slow down just a little bit. Just a tiny bit. It makes me think that I should do it, and I see that in some of my later work, and I'll give you credit for that.
All right. So John, we've got a goal. We need to slow her down.
All right, guys. Just a reminder: Michael offers one-on-one workshops. He does Lightroom tutorials, and I think some of the stuff is being done over Zoom or some other video conferencing. But when things lighten, what's the word I'm looking for? When we're able to get out and play again, if you're interested in a workshop, Michael's really just up the road. If you're in Texas, he's up in Fort Worth, so not that far. So be sure to reach out to him, and especially it's a good opportunity if you've been wanting to improve some of your photography skills. Good person to know. So Thanks. Next week, as a former pro, let me rephrase that. Next week, as a former photo editor for National Geographic Kids magazine, Karen Agner will share her views on being freelance, from photo editor to photographer and everything in between. So thank you guys for joining us tonight. And until next Wednesday, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we will see you again next week. All right, Aaron, shut me down.
Bye, everybody.